They told Corporal Nora Vikander she was too small to handle the weight, too quiet to lead under pressure, too soft for the job that required a particular kind of coldness. But on a scorching afternoon in Kandahar province, when the interpreter collapsed and the village elder refused to speak another word, it wasn't size or volume that mattered. It was the one skill nobody knew she had. Nora Vikander was 27 when she arrived at Forward Operating Base Artemis, a collection of dust-colored buildings and blast walls northwest of Kandahar. She was compact, barely 5'3". With pale blonde hair she kept tied back so tight it gave her headaches by noon. Most people assumed she was a medic or an admin clerk. She was neither. Corporal Vikander was a signals intelligence analyst with the 525th Expeditionary Military Intelligence Brigade, but her personnel file didn't mention the other skill that made her different. The one her grandmother taught her. During childhood summers in a Minnesota farmhouse where English was the second language spoken, the base hummed with generators and the constant radio chatter of patrols moving through the province. Nora spent most days in a windowless room filled with computer monitors, headphones pressed to her ears, listening to intercepted communications. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her evaluations always said the same thing: technically proficient, but lacks command presence. Too reserved for leadership roles. Nobody asked why she was so quiet. They just assumed she didn't have much to say. Nora's grandmother, Birgitta, had come to America from Afghanistan in 1979, one of the last to leave before the Soviet invasion made departure nearly impossible. Birgitta had worked as a translator for a Swedish aid organization in Kabul, and she'd married an American engineer she met there. They settled in rural Minnesota, where Birgitta raised 3 children and eventually helped raise Nora. Every summer, Nora stayed with her grandmother. They baked bread together, tended the garden, and spoke only in Dari and Pashto. Birgitta taught her the formal dialect used in government offices and the rough street vernacular of Kabul markets. She taught her the subtle differences between regional accents, how to recognize a Kandahari speaker from a Harati one. She taught her proverbs and poetry, the rhythm of polite conversation, the weight of certain words in a culture where honor meant everything. Nora joined the army at 22. Drawn by the education benefits and a desire to see something beyond Minnesota winters. During basic training, a language aptitude test flagged her as exceptional. Military intelligence recruited her immediately. They trained her in signals interception, pattern analysis, and electronic warfare. But they never asked if she already spoke the languages she was now being paid to monitor. She never told them. It felt like keeping a piece of her grandmother close, something that belonged to her alone. A private strength nobody could evaluate or put in a file. The disrespect started small. Captain Brennan, the intelligence officer who ran their section, had a habit of talking over her during briefings. When Nora flagged an intercepted communication suggesting a Taliban commander was moving through a nearby village, Brennan barely glanced at her analysis. "He's probably just passing through," Brennan said. "Not worth the resources to investigate." Staff Sergeant Kovac was worse. He'd served 3 deployments and made sure everyone knew it. When Nora mentioned she'd detected patterns in the radio traffic that suggested a possible weapons cache, Kovac laughed loud enough for the whole operations center to hear. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "I've been doing this job since before you graduated high school. Stick to your computer screens and let the real analysts handle threat assessment." The others didn't laugh, but they didn't defend her either. Nora felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her expression flat. She returned to her station and put her headphones back on. The moment that crystallized everything happened during a joint meeting with an Army Civil Affairs team. They were planning a community outreach operation in a village called Zari Dasht, trying to build trust with local elders. Captain Brennan presented the security assessment. Concluding the area was relatively stable. Nora raised her hand. She mentioned she'd been monitoring communications from that area for 2 weeks. The traffic suggested tension between village leadership and a Taliban subcommander who'd been demanding food and supplies. The language used was increasingly hostile. She recommended postponing until they had better intelligence. Brennan cut her off mid-sentence. "We have interpreters for a reason, Corporal. Your job is signals collection, not cultural analysis. The mission goes forward as planned." Major Okafor, who led the civil affairs team, gave Nora a sympathetic look but said nothing. In a room full of officers and senior enlisted, a junior corporal's opinion carried the weight of dust. "Before you hear what happens next, I want to mention something. This channel shares stories like Nora's because too many veterans do incredible things that nobody ever hears about. If these stories matter to you, hit subscribe. There are more that need to be told." That night, Nora lay on her cot in the female enlisted quarters and stared at the plywood ceiling. The air conditioner rattled, barely cutting through the heat. She thought about her grandmother, about the way Birgitta used to correct her pronunciation with infinite patience. "Language is a door," her grandmother always said. "You must knock properly or it will never open." Nora had knocked. She'd tried to share what she knew, what she'd heard in the voices of men speaking a language these soldiers didn't understand. She'd heard the anger in those intercepted conversations, the specific kind of fury that came before violence. It wasn't just words. It was tone, context, cultural reference. Things a computer couldn't flag and a regular interpreter might miss if they weren't listening for it. But she was a corporal. Worse, she was a young woman who looked like she should be checking IDs at the base exchange, not providing strategic intelligence. Her technical skills didn't matter if nobody believed she had the experience to interpret what those skills revealed. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling of being invisible even when she was standing right there. She'd felt it in high school when teachers assumed she wasn't paying attention because she never raised her hand. She'd felt it in basic training when drill sergeants overlooked her during leadership exercises. The difference was that here, being overlooked might get people killed. The Civil Affairs Patrol left at dawn. Major Okafor led a convoy of 3 vehicles carrying his team, an interpreter named Rashid, and a security element from the infantry company. Their mission was simple: meet with the village elder, distribute medical supplies, and assess what the community needed. Nora monitored communications from the operations center, her headphones filled with routine radio checks, patrol updates, and the occasional burst of chatter from other units operating in the province. Then, around mid-morning, she caught something else. A brief transmission in Pashto, encrypted, but poorly done. She isolated it, ran it through analysis. 2 men coordinating movement near Zari Dasht. One asked if the Americans had arrived yet. The other confirmed they had and asked if everything was ready. Nora's hands went cold. She pulled off her headphones and walked quickly to Captain Brennan's desk. "Sir, I'm picking up communications near the patrol location. It sounds like they're being watched." Brennan didn't look up from his reports. "They're always being watched." "Corporal, that's not actionable intelligence." "Sir, the language suggests coordination. Possible ambush setup." Now he looked at her, irritation clear on his face. "Did they specifically mention an attack? Did they reference weapons or explosives?" "No." "Sir, but the context, then it's not actionable." "Return to your station." Nora wanted to argue. She wanted to explain that in Pashto, you didn't always say things directly. Threats were often implied, wrapped in metaphor and cultural reference. The phrase one of the men used, about guests overstaying their welcome, was a common prelude to violence, but Brennan had already dismissed her. Kovac, sitting nearby, shook his head like she was a child bothering the adults. She went back to her monitors, her heart hammering against her ribs. 40 minutes later, Rashid collapsed. The word came through on the radio. The interpreter had suffered what seemed like heat exhaustion, possibly something worse. He was conscious but incoherent. The village elder, an influential man named Haji Kadir, spoke only Pashto and refused to continue the meeting without proper translation. Major Okafor requested guidance. Captain Brennan swore under his breath. The nearest replacement interpreter was 3 hours away at Kandahar Airfield. He looked around the operations center, calculating options. Nora stood up. Her voice came out, steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Sir, I speak Pashto. The room went silent. Brennan stared at her like she'd just announced she could fly. What? I'm fluent, sir. Dari and Pashto. I can interpret. Kovac actually laughed. You expect US to believe. My grandmother was Afghan, Nora said, cutting him off. She taught me from childhood. It's why I'm good at signals intelligence. I already understand what I'm hearing. Brennan's expression shifted from disbelief to rapid calculation. Major Okafor was waiting in a village with a collapsed interpreter and a frustrated elder who controlled access to intelligence on Taliban movements. The mission couldn't fail because of a language gap. Get in a vehicle, Brennan said finally. You're going out there. 20 minutes later, Nora was in the back of an MRAP racing toward Zari-dashed body armor pressing heavy on her small frame. The infantry soldiers with her kept glancing over like they weren't sure she was real. When they arrived, Major Okafor met her with barely concealed desperation. Please tell me you actually speak the language, he said quietly. Nora walked past him toward where Haji Kadir sat in the shade of a compound wall, his expression hard and closed. She greeted him in formal Pashto, using the respectful address for an elder, including a traditional blessing her grandmother had taught her. She apologized for the confusion and assured him that she was there to listen with the proper respect his position deserved. Hai Kadir's eyes widened. Then, slowly, his expression softened. He began to speak, and Nora translated. Not just the words, but the meaning beneath them. The Haji explained that a Taliban commander had threatened the village, demanding they refuse cooperation with Americans. He'd wanted to warn the patrol, but Rashid's dialect was from a different province and the cultural nuances had been lost. There were fighters positioned on the ridgeline, north of the village, the Haji said, waiting to see if the Americans would leave peacefully or if blood would be necessary. Nora relayed this to Major Okafor without hesitation. He immediately radioed for air support and repositioned his security element. The Taliban fighters, realizing they'd lost the element of surprise, withdrew before any shots were fired. The village was safe. The patrol was safe, and every person there now knew that the quiet corporal they'd dismissed was the only reason any of them were still alive. Back at the base, Captain Brennan called Nora into his office. She expected a reprimand for not disclosing her language skills earlier. Instead, he told her she was being recommended for a commendation and immediate promotion to sergeant. More importantly, he said, pulling up a chair so they were at eye level, I owe you an apology. We should have listened to you. I should have listened. Staff Sergeant Kovac was less gracious, but he stopped talking over her during briefings. The other analysts started asking her opinion on communications they'd flagged, recognizing that technical collection was only half the job. Understanding required context, culture, and a kind of knowledge that couldn't be taught in a military classroom. Major Okafor requested her specifically for future civil affairs operations. Haji Kadir, it turned out, had connections throughout the province, and he would only meet with patrols if Nora was present to interpret. Trust, he explained through her, wasn't about rank or equipment. It was about respect and the ability to truly hear what someone was saying. Nora still spent most of her time in that windowless room with her headphones on. But now, when she raised her hand during briefings, people stopped talking and listened. Not because she'd gotten louder or more assertive, but because they'd finally learned what her grandmother had tried to teach her years ago. Language wasn't just words, it was understanding. And understanding in a war zone was the difference between life and death.